What's up? This is your man, Jeff Johnson, and you're listening to WRUT Media. Stay right there. If you don't, you're going to miss something you need.
We're on the line today with Jeff Johnson. He is a trusted voice for information, a social activist, political strategist, speaker, executive producer, and the recent recipient of a 365 Black Trailblazer Award. How are you today, Jeff?
I'm fantastic.
Awesome. Well, we wanted to talk to you today because you got something great going on that I think our fans and our listeners will be pretty interested in. This week, 10 years ago, a storm hit the Gulf Coast, New Orleans, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, and it started brewing, turned into what we know now as Hurricane Katrina. You traveled back there recently to some of those areas to find out what it was like and what it was like then and what it is like today. In a documentary called Katrina 10 Years Later, Hell and High Water, which will be aired on BET. And we just want to know, what was that experience like and how long did it take you guys to film?
Well, what's great is, number one, New Orleans is in a much better place than it's been. But this was an opportunity for BT to have conversations with real people, not necessarily talking to politicians or policymakers or academicians, but real New Orleanians who had decided to come back. And 10 years after the storm, looking at these kind of resilient stories of people who had stayed, who had come back, who had built, who had invested, who had stuck things out, and really hearing through their eyes what 10 years later looks like. I've traveled quite a bit, and I've never stopped going to New Orleans, and have seen in many cases, people talk about the nearly 2,000 people who died in Hurricane Katrina, but they don't always talk about the city of New Orleans losing almost half of their population, going down to nearly 200,000 people from almost 480,000 people. 10 years later, we're seeing that the numbers are around 370,000 people. So that's a huge increase in the number of people that have gone back. And New Orleans is just part of the story, right? Because there's when you think about cities like Biloxi, Mississippi, that lost everything, there is this broad, complex story of an entire region. But the city of New Orleans is really the city that I think has captured so much of the world's attention.
Okay. Now, with that being said, you spoke a bit about some of the people who are coming, some of the natives that are coming back to New Orleans. What has the city done over the past decade to bring some of those New Orleans natives back who were displaced? Was there any kind of special projects in place to bring them back, and are there any projects in place to bring some of those who are still interested in coming back?
Well, I think the city, whether it's under Mayor Landrieu or previously, has always tried to create some space for folks to come back. But when a city had the level of disruption like New Orleans, it's not the kind of thing that one agency or one group of people can fix. And so I think that some of what you hear in the stories that we've captured, but if you have visited New Orleans, there are corporations that have done a good job. There are nonprofit organizations that have created resources for folks to be able to come back. There are community people. One of the people that we talked to was Wendell Pierce, and when you watch the show tomorrow, you get a real sense of how someone like Wendell, who frankly didn't have to come back, who had the resources to be able to make a great life for himself somewhere else, came back and not only created a level of I think this resilient move to be able to claim his own place and that of his family there, but created opportunities and economic opportunities for an entire community known as Pontchartrain Park. so, he's just one person that is an example of it really taking a village to define New Orleans and the Gulf Coast turnaround.
Okay, great. And I know back in 2007, you spoke with the Committee of Homeland Security. You gave a very extensive testimony to them regarding Hurricane Katrina, and you spoke about the corporate sector and the many celebrities who raised money for that area. Are we still seeing the corporate sector and the celebrities raising money, given some of the lingering effects of Hurricane Katrina? How has their involvement changed, or has it changed at all? Are they still giving to that same amount?
I think that obviously, like almost every tragedy that we see, whether it was the earthquake in Haiti, whether it was the nuclear power plant disaster in Japan, or whether it was the tsunami in Asia, whenever these kind of disasters happen, there's an immediate influx of funds. And the longer we get away from the date of the disaster, normally the less you see a concentration of giving. And Hurricane Katrina is no different. I think that what makes Biloxi and what makes New Orleans and what makes other areas of the region so powerful is it really is local folks and local companies. And so, you can think about there's a brother who was the general manager at the Hyatt Regency in New Orleans. And there's a great story about some of the work that he did, not only to save the lives of people while they were there, but what companies did to be able to support folks ongoing. And I think that if you spend any time in New Orleans, you begin to see the companies that have made deep-rooted investments. Some of those are well documented, and some of those are some of the more quiet stories of those that have just been able to expand job opportunity in certain sectors of the community to ensure that those that have moved back didn't move back without a job, but had opportunity. And some of those companies are those like Home Depot. But there's a large story that needs to be told. And we attempted to scratch at the surface of that by telling some of these individual stories. But there's a much deeper story inside the city of New Orleans and around the Gulf Coast.
Okay. Now, you speak a lot about the resilience of the people and the development efforts that have gone on over the past 10 years. Yet we still hear stories 10 years later that there are residents in the lower 9th Ward and the 7th Ward, just to name a couple, where the rebuilding is still not complete, where there's still some empty lots and a lot of work still to be done. What would you say about that, and what will this documentary show us regarding those kinds of accounts?
Well, Wendell Pierce in particular, who many know from The Wire and from other on-screen, kind of his on-screen brilliance, talks a lot about the residential component of it because that's where he has made a great deal of investment. One of the things that I don't think that people who haven't spent a lot of time in New Orleans or have not done the research don't realize that even poor people in New Orleans were homeowners. And you had homes that had been in families for 3 and 4 generations. And so you weren't talking about people that had a ton of disposable income. All of the equity and the wealth that they had was tied into their home. And when you had insurance companies that took tremendous advantage of large numbers of New Orleanians, either because they never had flood insurance, and so they had hurricane insurance, but when the floodwaters came in, it was really not as a result of the hurricane. It was as a result of the broken levees. And so you had insurance companies that didn't pay out. And then as you'll hear Wendell Pierce tell the story, even for some that had flood insurance, the amount that was paid was so little that it wasn't nearly enough to be able to deal with with the vast amount of loss that most of these homeowners experience. So sure, you've got a ton of communities where you still see vacant homes, where you still see homes that are, folks that have had the resources to demolish their homes, but not enough to be able to rebuild, but are keeping the lot with the hopes that they can do something with it at some point in time. It really is a tragic economic story that I hope more Americans are aware of, because you have New Orleanians that continue to be displaced and want to come home, but that don't have the job opportunities within New Orleans to be able to make that a realistic venture, and don't have the capital to be able to invest into a property that almost has to be demolished or renovated from the ground up to be livable again. So there's a real economic justice issue that continues to happen in New Orleans, and folks like Wendell Pierce are some of those on the front lines trying to make a difference.
Okay. Now, with the disproportionate amount of people who were able to afford to properly or effectively rebuild versus those who weren't, it's almost, you can almost guess that you can see the difference probably between the predominantly white neighborhoods and the African American neighborhoods. Has that created any kind of racial divide in the city, or has the city just really kind of come together despite the economic differences?
Well, I think we have to be honest about the fact that while there really is an economic issue here, right? So you've got a large number of African Americans that aren't able to move back, but you've got poor folks, period, that aren't able to move back. So New Orleans, like every other city, isn't without its racial issues, and New Orleans, like every other city, is not without a historical kind of racial strife that they work through. But I think it would be unfair not to acknowledge the fact that there are poor folks of all colors who desire to be back in New Orleans and can't. And there are wealthy people who are African American that have the ability to be able to put money into homes, save family members' homes. And so whether you're talking about those like Wendell Pierce or whether you're talking about others, whether they're in the corporate sector or whether they're entertainers that had resources to be able to rebuild, this is really an economic issue. Now, when you start talking about the vast majority of African Americans in the lower Ninth Ward and other parts of the city who are without, I think you've got a city that by and large has come together, and anybody that is about trying to make New Orleans better. I think you see New Orleanians of all ilks trying to support them in that process. And you hear that through a number of the stories, whether it's just a family member who was working to try to save their family, or whether it is a restaurant owner that attempted to make sure that their restaurant never closed and continued to serve members of an African American community. You hear those stories in Katrina 10 years later through Hell and High Water. And that's why I'm so proud to be a part of it, because you hear regular stories of regular people that said, I will not leave, I will come back, I will save this business, I will save my family, I will invest in my community. And that is what makes this documentary, as a reflection of this region, so powerful.
Okay. Now, you spoke of Wendell Pierce, and you spoke of some of the regular people in the community. Who were some of the other people that our fans may recognize that you spoke with during the filming of Hell and High Water?
Well, and that's the thing. If you're not a New Orleanian, you probably won't recognize any of these folks. And that to me is what's great about it. Like, so often we are looking to tell these stories through the lens of celebrities, and we're looking to tell these stories through the lens of notables. Wendell Pierce isn't a part of this documentary because he's an actor. Wendell Pierce is a part of this documentary because he's a New Orleanian who invested back in his community. And I think that is what this documentary is about. And so, if you will be introduced to owners of restaurants, and if you've really gone deep into the city of New Orleans, you might recognize them. But I think whether it's for the point of this interview or whether it's for the point of the documentary itself, what really makes this powerful is that these are not names of notoriety. that these are not people that got, 100,000 to 2 million followers on Instagram. That these are people who wake up and put on their clothes just like you and me every day, who struggle check to check just like so many of us every day, that had a decision to make. Do I make a sacrifice and stay in New Orleans, or do I leave and abandon everything that I've owned, so much of the legacy of my family, and just try to make a better life somewhere else? And each and every one of these people are a reflection of the now 387,000 New Orleanians that said, I'm coming back, I'm staying, I'm moving there to even make a new life. I'm making New Orleans home. Those are the people that we talk to.
And I think that's really great, because those real stories of real communities and the people that inhabit those communities are not overshadowed by the celebrity of it all. So that is really awesome. I'm glad that you guys were able to do that. But now if we could just jump back a bit to your 2007 testimony with Homeland Security for just a very brief moment. You listed a brief strategy that you said needed to take place specifically in the Gulf, consisting of the strategic development of legitimate public and private sector partnerships, the creation of affordable housing development partnerships between private sector and local CDCs, and number 3, the distribution of targeted grant funds to increase capacity of local organizations, nonprofits, and service providers with proven track records. Out of those 3 things that you listed in 2007, which would you say is the most important today, 10 years later, for that area?
That's a great question. And I think I don't know if I would put one over the other, because what we're talking about is an ecosystem of growth. And an ecosystem of growth requires all of those. But if you made me choose one, I would say that I still believe that the public and private sector partnerships that are around the development of mixed-use housing is still unbelievably important. One of the things that you'll learn when you watch this documentary is that there are income limitations. So if you make over a certain amount, there are certain communities where you're not eligible to come in and purchase homes if they've received funding from certain grants to build, which I think is problematic, because there are people who have resources that want to move in and invest in these communities, and then you have those who don't have the resources who are given grants. But if you're really talking about mixed use, you've got to be a little bit more flexible in the kind of stipulations you set, because you don't want to create an environment where only wealthy people are able to come in. But what you don't want to do is create communities where only people who make below a certain amount are able to come in. The strength of New Orleans has always been its community, and that community was always about those people who were doctors, lawyers, as well as garbage workers, as well as teachers, as well as celebrities. And if you know New Orleanians, they never put greater stock in the doctor or the entertainer over the garbage worker or the teacher. And the power of New Orleans was always about, and is always about, its people. So to directly answer your question, if there was one that I had to pick, it would be about how do you ensure the sophisticated creation of mixed-use residential neighborhoods where you've got wealthy people mixed with working-class people, to really add and rebuild and expand the culture that makes New Orleans such an unbelievably amazing place to be.
Okay, great. Now, again, I know that we've talked a lot about the resilience of the community and the community rebuilding. I want to know a little more about in the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina, there was a lot of controversy, and there were a lot of sentiments that regarding the government and FEMA, how they relaxed and how FEMA, when people did get aid, how they pulled out unexpectedly. I want to know, what is the sentiment for some of those residents in some of those areas regarding the government today and the government's response to aiding them, and as well as FEMA?
Well, you're never going to get New Orleanians. You're never going to get folks from Biloxi, Mississippi. You're never going to get people from the Gulf Coast to say they feel good about the government's response. The government dropped the ball. And whether it was FEMA ineffectively being able to ensure residential temporary residents through the trailer program, whether it was the road home debacle, whether it was the fact that there were environmental issues with some of the FEMA trailers that people lived in, whether it was the fact that the government waited so long to even come in and provide aid to certain places. You're never going to get people to feel good about that. And so that sentiment has not changed in 10 years. In fact, I'm sure it's been solidified as people have been able to hear other people's stories and understand how much the government failed them, not just in the immediate 5 to 7 days after the levees broke, but the ongoing service that was needed. I don't think you'll get anyone to say that they have trust in FEMA on any level who is a resident in the Gulf Coast region.
And with that being said, does anybody in any of your accounts give you any reasons why they feel like the government or FEMA had that lax reaction? I know you hear, well, the city was failing in crime and wages and education at the time, and you hear all types of conspiracy theories regarding things. Are there any accounts given as to why they feel like FEMA failed or the government failed?
No, I don't think that you've got a bunch of people that are experts in domestic policy or in administrative response. They know that as a human being, I should not have had to be on my roof. I don't give a damn why you didn't come. You didn't. Right? So I don't think that you have a bunch of people sitting there trying to weigh, was it the FEMA director, or was it Ray Nagin, or was it the governor, or was it President Bush that ultimately dropped the ball. I think that there is enough blame to go around on multiple levels as it relates to response times, as it relates to everything from the buses that many say were the city's responsibility for ushering people out of the city, to the relief work. You hear Wendell Pierce talk about how there are Army divisions that claim they can be anywhere in the world within 30 hours. Well, why weren't they in New Orleans? And so I don't think that there are regular citizens that spend a whole lot of time even dealing with the government response at this point. I think that their bigger issue is what happens now. Who are the people that are willing to invest in the region now? Who are the people that have been investing? One of the biggest issues, and one of the things that you're going to hear in the documentary, is around New Orleans schools. And so when you have the level of infrastructure that failed in New Orleans after the levees broke, one of those unbelievably important mechanisms are public schools. And when you look at the New Orleans public schools right now, it's like the Wild Wild West. There is a city of people and a state that are trying to figure out what are the best way to get schools working and servicing young people all over that city. Is it traditional public schools? Is it charter public schools? Is it non-public charters? You know, what is the formula that will make New Orleans public education system better? And you'll hear a pretty amazing principal talk about her school in particular, and about what education in New Orleans looks like and has the potential of looking like in the next 10 years.
Okay, great. Now, what would you say, Jeff, is the biggest takeaway from this special that airs tomorrow?
That real people make a difference. That so often, whether we are activists or whether we're just concerned citizens, so often we're waiting for other people to come and save us. And I think what this documentary says is while there are obligations that government infrastructure has, and while there should be a moral imperative for corporations to serve the communities that purchase their products and benefit their bottom line, when all is said and done, communities are saved by regular people that say, not on my watch. This won't die on my watch. I have something to give. I have something to invest. And if you don't get anything else from this documentary, is that whether you live in New Orleans, whether you live in Biloxi, whether you live in Cleveland, whether you live in Ferguson, whether you live in Houston, whether you live in L.A., when you look outside your door and you see something that you think could be better, you've got more power in impacting that than you would ever believe.
Awesome. You actually answered my next question. So that's
Great.
wonderful. That's wonderful. Tell us again where and when we're going to see this special, Hell in High Water.
You are going to see this special on BET tomorrow, the 26th of August, at 8 p.m. And again, it's Katrina 10 years later, through hell in high water.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Mr. Jeff Johnson. It was a pleasure.
My pleasure. Thank you.